right now Kateryna is with us. Great, perfect. So I'm pleased to welcome all of our participants today. And thank you very much for waiting us for our delay. Unfortunately, we had a longer delay than I've expected, but I do hope that all of our distinguished panelists and all of the distinguished speakers, they will make this event worth the wait. And thank you very much for joining us on behalf of the Center of the Economical Strategy and the German Economic Group in Ukraine. I'm pleased to welcome you, and also with the support of the Strategic Economical Research, we are pleased to welcome you here today. We're going to discuss the issues and challenges of the banking systems, of how we will evaluate the impact of COVID-19, because this year has a certain number of topics that we really would like to mention right now, because they are very important, very broad, and then discuss a separate discussion. So there is a topic of the COVID-19. The second topic is the loan and the loan policy for the National Bank of Ukraine and for the domestic loans, and also this important topic of budgets that is currently being discussed by everyone. So I do hope that we will briefly catch up on all of those topics in our discussions. I would like to welcome all of our participants of the panel today and the representatives of our first panel, Robert Kirchner, the deputy head of the Berlin Economics and German Economics Group in Ukraine, Kateryna Rozhkova, the first deputy of the National Bank of Ukraine's director, Vitaliy Kravchuk, the senior officer of the Economical Research and Political Consultation, and Garry Poluschkin, the project manager of the German Economical Group in Ukraine. So I would like to invite Robert Kirchner and to pass the floor to you to get the introduction started and to tell us a little bit of the project that we all have gathered today to discuss. So Robert, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria. I hope everybody can hear me also in translation. And good day to everyone, and a warm welcome from Berlin, Germany, here to our online discussion on how the Ukrainian banking sector gets through the COVID-19 pandemic and about the prospects for a recovery of lending. It's a real pleasure for me to open this event on behalf of the German economic team, which I represent, but also on behalf of our partners, the Center of Economic Strategy and the Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting. During our webinar, our online conference, we want to discuss the current situation in the banking sector of Ukraine, as well as its prospects for the next year, with a number of international and national experts, bankers, and policymakers. It's a particular honor for me to have Kateryna Rozhkova with us, the first deputy governor of the National Bank, who will soon deliver a keynote speech. At the same time, it's also a pleasure to have such a high level of distinguished experts assembled, which will help us later on to explore some of the issues raised in the presentations further. I think it is fair to say that Ukraine's banking system underwent a very deep and fundamental reform process over the last couple of years, resulting in a much sounder, yet also smaller sector. Monetary and exchange rate policy also underwent fundamental changes, as did the NBU as an institution. The current COVID-19 pandemic presents new and acute challenges to the whole economy, including the banking sector. This is a major theme of our new banking sector monitor Ukraine, which we have elaborated recently and which my colleagues will present later on, and which will serve as a basis for the discussion afterwards. Let me conclude by wishing all of us a lively discussion and a productive and insightful event. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, Роберта.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we have another speaker that we would like to ask a lot of questions. And I believe that's all of our participants, all of our panelists, and all of our attendees. I do hope that you'll have a lot of questions, but I would like to start with the three main questions to ask. And then throughout the next discussion, when we will have, you'll be also able to elaborate the issues and the questions and discuss in more details. But I would like to start with these three questions, and there's a lot of questions to cover, but still I've collected only three. So the reformed banking system that we've had, how it felt through COVID, how would you evaluate the results of this, let us say, purified reform system that has to be more sustainable in its all developments after we had this change? What do you believe how COVID impacted our system? My next question is, what is going to be the next policies of the National Bank of Ukraine because of the changes in the regulator? And the third issue, the third question would be that will basically very connected to the main topic of our today's event. So how should we transform the lending processes for to basically to get the lowest interest in the current history? So should we get to this issue? So those are the three questions that I have, and I would like to pass the floor to Kateryna Rozhkova to cover that. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think that I will start with answering the first question from your side. It's just that I would like to say that basically that is the very first, like, let's start with this. The COVID-19 is not an economical crisis, but it really strongly impacts the economy. And because of, first of all, the level of the consumption has decreased, this is the very first time in our history when the economical crisis is not supported by the banking crisis, by the financial crisis, basically. So understanding that, all of those measures on surging the banking systems and supporting the banking system is very good, and it shows the good results. It not only shows us the overall sustainability of the banking systems, it's always the importance for the good monetary policies in place. There has to be a lot of factors that combined all together. They have helped us to save Ukraine from a harder shock that could have been possible, that could have happened. So basically, saying that, we can say that we have passed through this crisis in more or less calm way. So, this is not a crisis. It's not a crisis of the equity. It's not a crisis of the liquidity of the banking sector. It's not a crisis of assets. It's basically that's from the very beginning of the quarantine has been established, we have seen that there has been some downflow from the deposits from the banking systems. We have seen that for around 2 first weeks after the quarantine and the lockdown has been started. But then we have seen the overall stabilization of the situation. Like, of course, there had been some panic in moods at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic. And of course, it has been also seen by the market, but it has been stabilized by the markets. If to speak why that happens, then of course we are in the close contact to the main central banks. And we understand that we have been talking to them for a lot of time already. We have seen what were the measures that have been used by the other central banks to support economy, to support the banking sector. We have to say that we were really fast in reacting to those challenges. We had three additional anti-crisis measures that we have introduced. The first was covering our monetary policies. And that's basically we have tried to decrease the rate of interest up till 6%, and this is unprecedented level for Ukraine. The second measure that we have taken, we have launched additional tools for the support of liquidity. And it's basically about the terms of the lending. So we added some additional opportunities for the standard refinancing for a longer period of time. We have started those additional tools like the percentage, the interest swap that helps the bank to hedge their risks, the interest risks. We have added up additional tools that we use as a mortgage when we have the refinancing mechanisms. We have included the overall municipal bonds, the entrepreneurial bonds, the bonds for the enterprises. And we have also created the bigger number of the liquidity auctions if it's going to be needed by the certain banks and by certain institutions. So the monetary, the markets operations are very important. And then there is the protectional reaction and protectional auditing. Well, first of all, we have terminated all of those additional tools of the traditional overview that has to be introduced throughout 2021. We have stopped any kind of any kind of testing notes and auditing for the banks. We have slightly mitigated our loan risks mechanisms for through the time of the period um, of this pandemic. So we didn't have this strong tool of influences ad hoc to the capital, and we're continually working on those tools that will help the banks right now and the banking system right now to restore to restore business as usual. Once again, would like to refrain that I would like to explain that if we compare the situation with the banking sector today with the banking situation that it used to be in the previous crisis periods, then we would like to say that we do not see really big systematic risks for the banking assets, for the liquidity of the banking sector. But what we see the challenges for the profitability and the effectiveness of the banking sector overall. The profits, or let us say the financial results of the banks that we currently see, they're decreasing. Why it bothers us as a regulator? Because basically profitability, the profits is one of the main sources of additional capitalization and monetization for the banks. Currently, we see that in the first 6 months of this year, the overall profits and income of the banking sector, even though it's quite sustainable and quite significant, it's slightly more than 32 billion hryvnias, but we see it is much lower than with the compared period of last year. So banks have already started to bring up their own reserves. They're bringing their own reserves to cover the potential losses if there's going to be the decrease in the assets quality because of the COVID-19 pandemics. What we also see that banks, especially at the first stages of the lockdown or now the quarantine, they have managed to provide any additional costs and additional expenditures in order to set out the online work, to set out the work of their branches, providing the certain safety measures and security measures. So there were also additional costs for the banks. Moreover, because there has been a decrease in the overall consumption level. It didn't happen all at once, but we currently see that the volume of the banking services and the demand for the banking services has slightly decreased, and we can already see that it already impacted the dynamics of the overall income for the banks. So, okay, it's not like the crisis of profitability, but basically that we can say the effectiveness of the banking sector is going to slightly decrease. But still, under our forecasts this year, the banking sector will still stay profitable. And if we speak overall, on how the banking systems have felt throughout the crisis, I would like to say that we're still going through that because basically we're still under the adaptive quarantine, we still have the additional vacation, taxation, fiscal vacation, basically. So right now, in order to neutralize this impact of this crisis for the banking portfolio, it will only be able when we will see the lending, holiday lending, vacation will be ended out. So basically, we already see that there is some certain recovery for the economy, but we need it to be more sustainable right now. We can see that there is improvement of the quality of the lending and loans portfolio, even though it's not significant. And I'm speaking about like on the new lending portfolio, not the legacy that we've had from the previous crisis that was mostly based in the state-owned banks. But we see that there are processes of restructuring the loans and the credits has been in place. But right now, it's really hard for us to evaluate the overall impact of this crisis while we're still going through that. Of course, the lockdown measures and throughout all over the world, they have really slowing down the development of economy. So basically, we see that the loan portfolio, they have shortly decreased. If we speak about the corporate sector, then it was a significant cut down. There was around 10% for the national currency and more than 6% in foreign currency. Speaking on the consumption portfolio, that there was the most important driver, that was basically the credit holidays that we have had. And it's important that we now have more clarity if we will, when we will end up, it will help us to establish the financial mechanism for additional loans providing. So on the level of the growth of the basically the customer and the consumption portfolio, this is the first time that we have the situation where the hypothec sector has been growing faster than the customer and than the consumption loans. And even though all of the additional impact for the economy, the Privatbank, Oszczędbank, Credit Bank, we have seen that there was the certain lowering of the interest for the national bank, which actually caused additional the decrease of the deposit interest rate. It has already made the loans available in terms of costs for the final customer. What are our forecasts? And we have already seen that in July, August, we have already seen that the activization of the lending has started in the corporate sector. What do we expect from the banks currently, and what do we see right now? Basically, we understand that the crisis we're still all living through and going through, it has very significant negative impact for the financial situation for big corporations and for the small and medium businesses and for the population overall. The profits and the income of people have decreased. A lot of people lost their jobs, and of course, it also influences the overall capacities of the lenders. So we have addressed the banks many times already that the banks should have work out, design, or adapt their own loan programs for specific new conditions rising. We have to understand that overall liquidity and the potential financial situation for the possible creditors, they're going to be recovered step by step. So all of those mechanisms that have worked before the crisis have to be adapted. We're speaking on the overall cost of the credit and the terms for those credits and loans and the interest rates for those. From our side, we'll keep on developing and designing. Okay, maybe not designing, but we keep on considering together with the banking community, we're considering the changes for the credit risks evaluation that will basically going to help us to decrease the overall pressure on banking capital so that bank can re-establish and recover their financing. Speaking on the cost and of the resources right now, so what do we have now in our banking systems? We know that the overall cost is slightly higher than the overall profitability of the deposit certificates for the National Bank, but it has decreased seriously. For example, the overall cost for Ukrainian hryvnias deposit has decreased from the moment that we have decreased our key interest rate from 11% to up to slightly lower than 9%. This is a serious opportunity. And I think that I'm getting to the third or the second or even third question. I'll get back to the second question in a minute. But it's basically that is the serious opportunity for the banks to once again reconsider the profitability on their loans. Because if we will take the average cost of Ukrainian hryvnias loan providing, so we have sometimes when we have 4.5%. Of course, under this cost of liabilities, then the banks should also reconsider their own policies in order to decrease their margin. So as far as we know, that's once again the liquidity of the clients, their financial situation will recover step by step, and so the epoch of the high interest rate is already behind us. We need to find the new tools and we need to find the new ways how we should work further on and how we can bring back our effectiveness and profitability, even throughout the optimization of processes and throughout automation of huge number of processes involved in the banking system. Speaking on the rates, the loan rates and the credit rates that are currently being offered, We know that depending on the market segment, depending on the transparency of the company that work in the market and considering their already credit story that they've had, the interests are going to be very different. If you have a good credit history already in place, like starting from 9 to 12% in national currency. Yes, of course, this kind of rate is not available for all of the lenders and not all of the banks are going to offer you that because that once again, you always have the credit loans. On the other hand, you have to weigh out the credit risks that are still quite high. But we keep on working in this direction and we have been very active in this direction also. So how to transform this rate, how to provide this transmission between the key interest rate for the national bank? Uh, well, the banks, they cannot stop giving the credits out. So they still have to adapt to their programs to the new demand and to the new situation. This is an important thing for all of us. Second thing, we're working on decreasing the credit risks, especially in the legislation. We had a working group working on that. We are very serious about that. We have already worked out the amounts of amendments and offers. We're continuing to work on the updating the legislation together with the Ministry of Justice, together with the Cabinet of Ministries, of how we can minimize those risks, how we can change the Ukrainian legislation or how we can change additional bylaws in order to decrease the credit risks for the banks. The third direction is going to be the governmental programs. 579 is currently working, so we already offered the government to broaden up the 579 decree on the accessible and available e-boat mortgages and using additional state guarantees. Overall state guarantees in order to take down and decrease the credit portfolio of the banks. There are some offers from the international economical organizations of how to offer the so-called mechanisms of sharing the credit risks between the state and the private sector by providing some state guarantees. So we're working on those directions, and we are still hoping that there's going to be some significant results in these directions also, but only with our joint efforts. And a lot, it will, of course, will depend on the lendees themselves, because basically it will depend on whether there's going to be transparent ownership structure. That is a very serious issue currently for all of the banks. And as far as I understand that this is basically the banking main policies, and they're trying to be very just on evaluating the risks that they have to accept. So it's not only about the banks that have to adapt, but the lendees also have to adapt to the new situation. Speaking on the next position of the national banks in our overall overview policies. So we're still going to be on the risks-oriented overview and supervision. If we're going to speak about our general requirements, they're still going to be with no additional changes. After this year, the fiscal year is going to end up, and we hope that by the end of the year, we will already identify the final situation with our credit vacation. So we basically would like to evaluate the assets and equities without doing the stress testing. So we basically would like to do like a snapshot in order to understand what was the overall impact, negative impact for COVID-19 pandemic for the banking sector. After that we will, together with the banking community, we will get back to discussing the issue of in what way and when we will be able to introduce all of those additional traditional requirements and traditional norms, that regulations that have been planned before the COVID-19. Of course, we will introduce those planned practices. The issue is when, because our task currently is that's to provide the sustainability of the banking sector. But on the other hand, our main task is also to keep on working in a more stimulating way so that the banks would once again restore their activities, and especially the lending activities, and to restore economy. So this is our monetary policy is currently like this. So both they are stimulating. So basically those are the standard approaches to all of the central banks in those situations, and we'll keep on moving on this way further on. So this is basically my very short answers to those questions. They have to be much broader and deeper, but I believe that throughout the discussion we'll discuss it in a more high quality way and even in a more interesting way. Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kateryna. And I would like to invite my colleagues from our German economical group and for the institutions of political consultations and economic research. I would like to invite them to present us their monitoring of the banking system. This is basically the overview that focuses on those issues that Kateryna has already voiced out. But basically, this has a very systemic approach. So I would like to pass my floor to the colleagues, please.
Так, Гаррі, Віталій.
So Garry, Vitaliy, who would like to start? Vitaliy?
Vitaliy.
I just was expected a bit of another introduction, but okay, let's move forward. Okay, so let's move to the first substantial slide, I guess. So this our monitoring contains two main parts. One is the general overview, which looks at the statistics and trends in the banking sector. This part will be presented by me. And then there will be the special issues section, which will cover topics of interest, which are current in this year. Then I will give the floor to my colleague Garry. So I will present the general part, as I said. So first is the comparison in the regional context of our Ukrainian banking sectors. You can see in terms of bank assets to GDP, Ukrainian banking sector is quite small. If you look at our neighboring countries, from Russia to Belarus, quite significantly smaller. This is because of this last efforts of banking sector reform, the cleanup of the banking sector, which resulted in quite small remaining banking sector. So over the last few years, we saw some increase in the bank assets, but they grew slower than the GDP, which meant that assets to GDP ratio still declined over the last few years. Okay, next slide, please. So here we can see another side of this cleanup I mentioned before. So we had 180 banks before the crisis. Now we have a bit more than 70, which is exactly what we needed to do to clean up the banking sector, I guess. But over the last few years, we saw that the number of banks more or less stabilized because the crisis more or less was over. There was some cases of bank closures or reorganizations, but we can see them as systemic. But still, the legacy of this large cleanup effort is still ongoing. We have about more than 50 banks that are still in liquidation, which means that there are still issues that will have to be settled before we can say that the cleanup is complete. So the next slide, please. So if we look at the composition of the banking sector, you can see that after the private bank was nationalized, over 50% market share of the state-owned banks. And still it's a bit high if you look at the overall numbers. If you look at the number of share of state banks in loans, it's a bit less, about 39%. If you look at the other types of banks, so the foreign-owned banks more or less stable, the private banks again stable, but low because the cleanup fell disproportionately on the private-owned banks because they had more problems, obviously, and Russian banks are now more or less a matter of the past because of the sanctions, and that's, I guess, it. So the next slide, please. So as we can see, the concentration is increased over the last years, again, because of the cleanup and because the larger banks had a bit better chance of surviving the crisis, the previous crisis, than the smaller banks. But still, even now, this concentration is not unusual. For 60%, we a bit higher than Russia and Poland, but not that much. Okay, but we should remember that if you talk about top 5 banks, 4 of these banks are state-owned, so it's a bit of a problem. Okay, next slide, please. So if you look at the loan portfolio of banks, we can see that it's quite a bit smaller than for our peers, especially if you look at not on the gross loans, but on loans after provisions. This is because, of course, again, cleanup of the banking sector meant that loans to the related parties, so the loans that not were really loans are now not counted in our statistics. But still, it means that the remaining loan portfolio and conservative, more or less conservative, relatively conservative loan policy of the last few years means that loan penetration and the role of the banking sector in helping the real sector of the economy grow is quite small if you look at our neighbors. So next slide, please. So again, here, if you look at the loan growth, which is gross loans, we saw a bit of pickup in 2017, 2018 after the crisis. Now it's a bit slower because legacy loan portfolio is now being worked out. New lending is growing faster than before, but still it's not enough to get real fast growth of the loan portfolio. As a result, loans to GDP, as we saw on the previous slides, went down. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the reasons why we have this sluggish loan growth and conservative lending is we still have quite high level of the non-performing loans. Again, many of these loans are indeed legacy loans, but still we have some quite high level of NPLs in new loan portfolio, I would expect, and legacy loans still drag down the loan growth, and so to be able to grow, we will have to move past this problem. Again, we have some gradual improvement over the last few years, but COVID-19 didn't help in this regard, so we had some increase in losses on loans, increase in loan provisions, which resulted in we had a bit higher NPLs over the last few months. Hopefully, this tide will return to decline in NPLs as soon as possible. But this is the question of an NBU policy, which will have to be addressed by the NBU. The next slide, please. So we see the deposits grow quite significantly over the last years, and were less impacted by the crisis, which means in terms of significantly faster growth of loans as compared to the faster growth of deposits as compared to loans means that loans, bank lending, are more or less entirely now covered by deposits, which is a healthy approach. Of course, this also means that a bit of constraint in terms of what kind of new lending can be provided, given the dependence on the new deposits. Still, overall, it's a very positive development, I would say. Okay, next slide. So again, we see the other side of this change in the funding pattern of Ukrainian banks. So deposits went significantly up and external funding went significantly down. On the second chart, you can see that there are still some loans that remain to be repaid, but lending repayments are comparatively low and should be more or less quite manageable for Ukrainian banks. So here we can see that the structure of bank funding changed quite significantly in terms to bank deposits. Okay, next slide. So all these previous developments in terms of conservative growth of lending, increase in deposits, less risky funding sources means that banks became more profitable, and that in turn means that they quite significantly became better capitalized. So on average, we see over 20% of capital adequacy ratio, which is, I would say, quite high. Of course, in part, this reflects high capitalization of the state-owned banks, but still, if you looked at other private banks, they seem to be also well capitalized. So this is quite positive development. Ukrainian banking sector, and I guess that helped to build the capital buffer to be better prepared for this latest COVID-19 crisis. Okay, next slide. So here we can see that banks became better capitalized through their profits. Indeed, we can see on the bottom chart that Ukrainian banking sector showed one of the best return of assets in our neighborhood, quite better than our other neighboring countries. Of course, this year we saw quite a bit high loan loss provisions, which means that return of assets would be probably lower, but if we may still see quite healthy returns of our Ukrainian banks if we compare to our peers. I would expect this year as well. Okay, next slide, please. So interest rates, we see that responded quite well to the recent record decrease over the last 18 to 24 months from 18% to 6% in June. We saw comparable decreases in loan deposits and in loan interest rates and in deposit interest rates. And it seems that the policy interest rate transmissions really, as Deputy Governor mentioned before, works quite well over the last few months. And there are no signs of the COVID-related stress that would impact the interest rates over the last few months, which is quite positive. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So next slide would be for my colleague Garry, which will present the special part of the presentation.
Thank you, Vitaliy. As you said, on the following slides, we will focus on special topics which we found of importance in the Ukrainian banking sector. The first step is a look at the law regarding improving mechanisms of banking regulation. The adoption of the law was one of the priority preliminary steps for the standby arrangement with the IMF, which led to the first tranche of $2.1 billion in June. This reform shall also support financial stability and guarantees irreversibility of bank resolution. A liquidated bank cannot re-enter the market. Instead, its shareholders will get financial compensation. Furthermore, this law is also a reaction to attempts by previous owners to get their insolvent bank back via local court decisions, in particular with the nationalization of Privatbank. Court's authority to revive banks is limited in most world countries, including EU member states. The law will permit detecting problem banks on earlier stages and resolve banks at a lower costs. The NBU can decide on the basis of professional judgment on banks' management practices. The next topic considers the 579 program. Thereby, the government addresses the problem of SME financing by subsidies from the state budget. The program was established in June this year. The State Fund for Development of Entrepreneurship compensates the difference between a basis rate and a loan interest rate and provides partial credit guarantees. The fund was given 2 billion hryvnia from state budget this year. In August, the volume of loans under this program crossed 5 billion hryvnia, and around 20 banks have been taking part in the program and signed more than 2,000 loan contracts. To conclude, this instrument is important to ensure low cost for SMEs and for micro enterprises. Now we continue with a look on the split law, which targets at increasing transparency in the regulation of non-bank financial institutions and adjusts the regulation to international standards. The law adopted in 2019 provides the dissolving the National Financial Services Commission and splitting up its regulatory functions between the NBU and the National Securities and Stock Market Commission. From the adoption on, the NBU will be responsible for the insurance market, leasing, and non-bank financial companies, while the National Securities and Stock Market Commission will be responsible for private pension funds and construction financing funds. After a transition period, the function of regulation was taken over by the NBU from the 1st of July this year. Future regulation adjustment is planned to be done with close cooperation with international partners and the IMF. As a next step, we look at the COVID-19 impact on the Ukrainian banking sector. The crisis originated in the real sector and could easily go to the financial sector, but the NBU reacted proactive and tried to avoid a spillover on the financial sector. The economic consequences of the pandemic led to a simultaneous demand and supply shock, and we forecast a 7% GDP decline for 2020. Due to past reforms, in particular the increase of the capital adequacy ratio, the Ukrainian banking sector is much better prepared than in previous crises. Also, the flexible exchange rate and inflation targeting policy worked as a shock absorber and allowed the NBU to ease its policy rate. As an impact of the crisis, NPLs are expected to increase as certain borrowers will face solvency and liquidity problems. But so far, there are almost no visible effects on NPLs. However, this can also be related to temporarily relaxation of credit risk classifications by the NBU, which are part of a bigger package to deal with the crisis. Moreover, widespread state ownership and small size of the sector limit further the damages. The last topic we would like to cover is a deep look on the importance of central bank independence. The resignation of Jakub Smolny, mentioning political pressure, put this issue into the spotlight. By law, the law of Ukraine on the national bank, the central bank independence is guaranteed. Article 4 tasks the NBU to ensure the stability of Ukraine's monetary policy, in particular price stability. The independence is also emphasized by international partners and was highlighted in the recent IMF program. The displayed diagram reveals a strong negative relation between average inflation and the average of a central bank independence index. We see that countries having a rather weak independent national bank show on average high inflation rates. If accounting for hyperinflation outlier in some transition economies during the 1990s, the relation does not change. So having in mind this analysis, we would like to finish the presentation and go to the discussion. The presentation can be also downloaded from our website. Thank you.
Гаррі та Віталій, я дуже вдячна вам обом за
Garry
презентацію.
and Vitaliy, thank you very much for your presentation. I remember how you were preparing this presentation, and now I have heard the presentation, both Kateryna, Rozhkova, and your presentation. And right now, yes, it looks like the risks for the liquidity because of this growth of deposits and the outflow of loans. There's not a lot of problems with that, but there's much more lending problems that we might face. And the separate attention for the 579 program in your presentation is also very good, because currently today we have a additional discussion panel that has been invited for today, and we are going to have Ruslan Gashev among the panelists, and I haven't yet met him, and we also have a very good way for us to meet one another, because there's a lot of questions about this program, a lot of discussions about this program, but we will have this opportunity to discuss it straight away. So Ruslan, we have you with us? Okay, Ruslan, so what I really wanted to ask you about, so I will just give us a little bit an outline of our further on format of work, and then I will pass to the questions that we would like to discuss directly. So like overall, I think that you already got to understand that the first question is going to be to Ruslan about this program, but basically, I would like to invite all of the participants of our panel discussion to join us. I would like to invite all of our attendees and all of our viewers to react to everything that is going to be said, to participate in this discussion, to express your opinions on some certain issues that are going to be discussed. And yes, we have invited Ruslan Hashev, who is the CEO of the Foundation of the Development of Entrepreneurship in Ukraine. So he's basically this person who has initiated 579 decree. We have Alexander. We have also Alexander Posaruk, who is the head of Raiffeisen Bank Aval, head of the corporate management, and he has been preparing for participation of the Forum of the International Economical Foundations. We've also invited Vitaliy Shafran, who is also the member of the Council for the National Bank of Ukraine. We're also waiting for Olena Koropkova. She should have joined us also, but we cannot see her yet. And Andriy has told me that she had some certain problem with connection, so maybe she didn't manage to join us yet. So what are we going to do further on with our discussion? So we will just have an hour of time. So I would like to ask you to dedicate this hour for half an hour for the discussion, and then half an hour for the questions that we have from the audience, because I would really I see a lot of people among the attendees, the people who would really like to see among the panelists. So yes, we can discuss it for eternity, but let us try to structure our discussion. So I'll have the first question to Ruslan on the 579 loans, because we see that the loans is slightly falling off, and we see that this problem has been already worked for a couple of years. So it might really, it's booming, and a lot of people are now speaking more and more, and the state guarantees they're also speaking more and more. So what do you think? It is a success or is dropouts? What do you think of how it should be developing further on? Why these entrepreneurs never asked for the banks before this program was launched, and why they're now participating in this program? Thank you very much for the question. I'll try to be very brief, but from the very, very beginning, how we had this program in place. So basically that was an That was an overall intent and action from the president's office for the government of Ukraine, and it started not from this public notification that we will make a video, and we'll create a program. We will make this program of the accessible credits and accessible loans for the entrepreneurs, for them not to go abroad, but for them to have this opportunity to work in Ukraine. It all started slightly before all of those videos were made. There was the 2 acts by the president of Ukraine that presupposed that there were the first steps on reforming and developing economy, the social economical sphere, so on and so forth. At that very moment, it was already presupposed to create the mechanisms of the accessible and available credits and to provide the mechanisms of the guaranteeing the loans for the SMEs. And 2 months later on, after those 2 acts were effective, we've had this addressed by the president that the programs has been established. From the very beginning, the program was made of 2 main components. Right now, most frequently, those 2 different components are not being identified in the framework of one program, but I would like to emphasize the first of all was the compensation of the rates, which was basically quite clear, and the second mechanism was the additional partial guarantees. Those are guarantees from the foundation, not the state guarantees, but the government through the Ministry of Finance has fully advanced us so that we basically could provide those partial guarantees. And in the public sphere, we're not mentioning these mechanisms a lot, but basically I would like to say that this guarantee has already been issued by the 90, it was already issued 92 guarantees on the overall 183 million hryvnias in this 579 program. It means that those lendees who didn't have a lot of the property to apply for the mortgage for the loan, then the foundation has covered them partly in this guarantee. So those are these 2 components of the main program. It was planned that the program will be only directed on the development of micro and small businesses. We only thought that is going to be only for the investment needs, only for additional equipment procurements, modernization of procurements, additional updating and innovating of the premises, but the program has started working at the very beginning of February, and up till the beginning of the corona crisis, there was just a month of the proper work. So this month was needed for the banks, just for them to set up their processes, to adapt their processes for the requirements of the 579 programs. And as soon as banks have started providing their loans, the corona crisis started. And basically, we started to think that under the current conditions, it was very ambitious from us to say that the banks will be ready to provide these credits for the enterprises for the investment goals, and both the entrepreneurs that were not ready to provide any kind of really significant steps on investing into their businesses to provide an additional capex to their businesses. So that is why we have had this second directions in the framework of the program, like additional refinancing for the already provided loans. And I would like to emphasize a very important thing. Not a lot of people, they believe that the refinancement is not important under the current conditions. We believe it is a very important element for the support of businesses. It's not a development program. It's basically the last resort program for the businesses, the program for helping the businesses to survive the corona crisis. Even if businesses were able to provide for those credits, provide for those loans, even if they were able, if they had these opportunities and capacities to do that, the businesses still started to save this money and to redirect it to the different needs. For example, they've started to preserving maybe their jobs and working places for their employees. Maybe they've bought additional goods for the certain realization. So there was an important moment of the state support for the businesses, the refinancing of the loans that has already been taken by the businesses. So we believe, and the Ministry of the Finance believes, that this component of the program, additional referentialization of the old credits of the old loans is temporary moments. There's something that has already been said, that this loans for additional refinancing has been provided for this till the quarantine is on, the adaptive quarantine is on, and plus 95 days. After that, it will be closed. But currently, what we have seen, that currently there are some certain entrepreneurs and businesses that are still going to take some credits on investment goals. Those are not really big amounts of money if we compare it to overall program. If our program grows from 60 million hryvnias up to 1 billion hryvnias, so they also usually have it on a weekly basis and around 350,000 million hryvnias. And this is basically, we believe that this is the main goal for our program that should be developed further on. So in the long-term perspective, the program should be dedicated mostly on the investment loans. What do we have at the current moment? So I can voice out some of the figures that are not yet in the public sphere. They're not ready yet published. That's going to be published today, but I think that I can already voice them out, that currently for the last week, the program has grown on around 600 million hryvnias up till 642 billion hryvnias. We already have additional loans for more than 406 million hryvnias. We have refinanced loans on around 7 billion hryvnias, and we have provided the investment credits for 1,478 million hryvnias. And I would like to say that we have also accepted 92 guarantees for almost 173 million hryvnias. And I would like to also say a couple of words about these guarantees, these partial guarantees that we provide. A lot of lenders, I believe that the banks do not offer them this tool unless they will have additional property, mortgage property. That's true, partially that's true, but the both lendees and the overall society, they have to understand that the decision to provide you a loan is done by the bank, not evaluating what kind of mortgage you will have and what is the overall amount of the mortgage. The bank, first of all, evaluates the financial reporting of the lendee and will evaluate the business reputation on whether they're ready to work with a certain person or organization or no. And only after that, this bank will cover these financial issues, that this lendee is going to be acceptable for the bank, and we are going to establish the business relationship with them for around 5 years that we will provide him the loan with. If we are okay with their business reputation and I can accept this lendee on that, only after that the bank will start discussing the loans. And only after that, if the lendee doesn't have enough property, then the bank will offer them the credit guarantee by the fund. All of those rumors that the fund considers something or does not consider anything, that they have some kind of the under curtain decisions whom they would like to provide these guarantees, that's not true. So basically, we do not have this kind of mandate for, because basically the banks identify who will they have guaranteed by the fund. We only write down the criteria that lendee has to meet so that the bank can apply the guarantee, our guarantee from us. So basically, we're only accepting this guarantee and we're only controlling whether the bank is paying all of the additional payments for these guarantees to us. That's all. That's it. I also would like to outline another moment what was also discussed, the accessible credits. So basically, a lot of people say they're not that accessible, and it's impossible to apply for that one. Well, you can say this way, but as far as I understand what is acceptable credits are, it's not just like any kind of lendee. They can come up to the bank with a package of documents and they can be applied for the credit. It's not what the accessibility is about. It's about, as president and the government has voiced out during the launch of this program, is that the lendee can be provided with the good conditions of servicing this loan, speaking on the rate also. So you can pay your rate 579 or even at 0% according to the program's details. And based on the mechanics, that's basically the program is very different from many other compensational programs that have been available before, when the lendee needed to cut down all of the all of the rates that have been interest rates that have already been calculated by the bank, and only then when it will be accepted and the bank will provide all of the information to the foundation will then repay some certain share of the credit of the already interest rate that has been paid by the lendee. We're doing it in a different way. So if the lendee will pay all of the all of the interest rate, if they have paid their share of the interests, then the banks unconditionally will already take from our accounts the needed amount of money that will further on covering the rates of interest for the lendee. So this is the very significant difference from this program from all of the other previous programs available. So we say that the banks, they understand that there is some certain opportunity for them to broaden their credit lines with the help of our program, knowing that they already have this money at their accounts and the foundation will provide 100% monetization for their money. And just to wrap up, just to wrap up my speech, maybe we'll have some additional questions. I would like to identify any important moments that quite recently in the second reading, it has been approved by the parliament, it has been signed by the president, so it's almost an effective law. The new law that introduces the new approach of the Ministry of the Finance to provide guarantees. So basically, we're providing once again the partial portfolio guarantees for the loans that can be broadened not only in the framework of 579 program, but also can be broadened to any other programs. So this is a win-win story for us, we believe, because the Ministry of Finance is exchanging their approaches to the overall debt policies and guarantee provision. So the Ministry of Finance is not only taking the certain risks for a couple of dozens billion hryvnias providing their guarantee credits, but they working with the small lenders, and even if there's going to be significant defaults in the framework of this portfolio, the overall number is not going to be will be insignificant for the Ministry of Finance itself, because we believe that it's really unlikely that like all of the small lendees will default in the same time. So speaking on the debt policies and lending policy of the Ministry of Finance, it's a very good step. And it's not to haven't been invented right now. It was like September last year when we have spoken about making this overall residential credits cheaper for the opening up of the land market. The Ministry of Finance has provided the additional decree to the Cabinet of Ministry to evaluate the overall directions of how we can make the credits and the loans cheaper before the land market will be open. And you also had the alternative offers from the Ministry of Economy to create a separate foundation, to create a separate fund as a legal entity that will provide additional guarantees for the agricultural producers. It's going to be much more effective way. It's not going to be spending a lot of state money, but it will just transform the way policy under which the ministry will provide its guarantee. So we believe this is going to be the right way to do, and it will be very popular among the banks, and thus the Ministry of Finance will even delegate the risks between itself and the banks. And in case of default, they will also have their share of responsibility. And of course, when this mechanism is going to be acting, was going to be effective and it will take force, it will substitute the loans guarantees of the Foundation of the Entrepreneurial Development under the framework of 579 program. But this will be very easy for us. We will maybe redelegate the amount of money for them certain other aims. Maybe we will create our own crediting and loans providing program for the SMEs. Maybe we will do that under the interest rates of the National Bank. Thus, that's just to briefly outline how the program has started, what this program is like now. Maybe you'll have any additional questions about the program 579, so I will cover them gladly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ruslan. That was really important and interesting. And I have a certain dilemma because after that, after what you have said, we would like to pass to the issue of the banking lending and banking loans, whether it's also that successful compared to the lending for the investment lending and your program. And on the other hand, there is an issue of the state guarantees on those loans that have been already provided. And this question like an elephant in the room, which is the question of the budgets. The budgets and all of the other state commitments of how do we going to reconsider them next year. There's a lot of other commitments, so this is a very hard decision for me, but I think we will discuss the banking sector and the lending sector overall, and then we will pass to get to the budget of how do we see our further on development. So I would like to ask the question to Alexander Pisaruk. So basically the investment credits, that's 1.9 billion, so 579. Why the banks are not competitive to that? Why they do not provide the credits for the investments, for the enterprises? Why do we see the overall decrease in level of the loans provided, and what should we do in order to make it increase? Yes, thank you very much, Maria. I believe that Ruslan has been very good in answering this issue. I can just repeat what he said. It's basically, the peak of the crisis in any country all over the world. We can see that it's basically that's overall liquidity of the payments is falling out. So there is also, as Kateryna and Ruslan has said, and our colleagues from the um, from what we already said, that they're basically that said that their companies or even the natural persons, they're trying to save more money than loan more money, because they believe that during the crisis it's much better to be conservative than to loan additional money. So basically this is also the big problem when they're, for example, so this is the problems from liquidity, then they might have this really good demand for the loans. But this is about the banks are not going to provide. But those people who can have loans, they're not going to take that during the crisis. This partly answers the questions why the investment credits in 579 didn't really work out well yet, because the lendees do not really want to take it and the banks do not really want to give it because the risks are really high during the crisis. But I believe that the government has done the right thing and the fund had done it in the right thing. They broadened the program, so when they started the refinancing of the current credits and the current loans, that was the right decision to make. And I believe that when it has been done, the program, as we have said, has been launched. The demand has been established. The banks have started to provide in those loans. And basically, they already have a certain advertisement in this. But I think that I would like to also voice out what Ruslan has already said. It shouldn't be the main aim and the main goal of the program, because for us as a Raiffeisen Bank of Val, we are the biggest creditor that has signed up in the framework of this program. And what we see from our clients, from clients that have already addressed us, is that a part of those clients, they could have stayed without the credits, like without the loans, because they have this financial opportunity to pay out on their credits, on pay out on their rates. So it's basically, if we would say, there's not very efficient usage of the fiscal resources of the state. Yes, we should support the companies during the crisis, but we should not stick to this element of the program for a too long period of time, because basically that will be basically spending the fiscal resources of the state. I agree that the 579 program in 2021, when we expect the economy to stop recession, then it should concentrate on the investment loans, because there are higher risks there for both the lendee and the banks, but it should concentrate on that. So I would agree with that, or with what Ruslan has said. So, okay, I will continue then the topic of the crediting and the loans, and with the number of no profitable loans then, because we have identified that there will be the supervision, but with no stress testings. But how do you feel that? How do you say that? What's going on with the NPLs with you? How do you think is the situation with overall NPLs in the banking systems? Because we cannot see those non-profitable loans yet. What is the overall dynamics of the portfolios that currently exist? Well, thank you, Maria. Maybe Raiffeisen Bank is not a very good example, because the quality of the loan portfolio that we have is one of the best. We seem to be one of the two banks with the lowest level of the NPLs in the system. So in our portfolio, we do not see the overall worthings of the quality of the portfolio for all of the sectorals of our clients. So both the clients from the SMEs and the corporate businesses as well. So we have, there was a very small decrease in the portfolio quality, but we have to understand why it's happening, because basically the country is only starting to get back to business. So the country has got out of the really harsh lockdown in May, in the end of May, and we have seen it throughout the amount of transactions that we do. We're a big bank, we have a lot of transactions, so there's a lot of payment, currency exchange, credits, loans, card operations. So all of it, starting from June and July, it started to grow. So basically, right now we have the overall volume of transaction before that we had even larger than before the crisis. It gives us the understanding that the economics is back to work. The economy is back to work. So basically, because of, we had 400 people who had COVID-19 on a daily basis. Now we have 4,000. But still, the economy is back. People have their salaries, people spend money, and we can see that in the amount and the volume of the transaction provided. So basically, it has a certain correlation with our client activity and the quality of our portfolio. So the portfolio's quality doesn't decrease significantly because economy started to work, because economy got, let us say, reopened. But there is a high price to pay because on the social distances, and unfortunately, this is the compromise that we have to take in order to keep economy working. Yes, that's true. We can see that throughout our country, and I would like to have this moment for advertise this our product. We have this the recovery tracker. We're trying to get every day's physical data on the banking transactions overall, the consumption of electric energy, the insurance for the people, additional vacancies that are being provided. So everything that gives us the opportunity to understand what is the recovery of the economy on a daily basis. So yes, this is something really happening. The amount of the banking transaction, the volume of the banking transaction is now higher than before the crisis. We're not yet using the Raiffeisen Bank Aval data, but we will be able, if we will be happy to add it if it is possible. Another question I wanted to ask, the question on crediting and loans, but I think I will just preserve it later on, and I will ask the issue of the budget. Because the budget is something that really worries me. On the side of guarantees that are going to be provided in the 579 program, there's going to be a certain pressure for the budget, and also the overall, the huge budget deficit, what is going to be happening next year. So I know that our partners from Germany, now that Robert, and I'm going to mostly addressing you at this moment, that I know that you have seen this interconnectedness between the monetary and fiscal policies. Have you seen those risks that we have considered in our case, the growth of the budget deficit and the potential refinancement because of the internal sources, so basically through the additional bonds in the internal level on the banking level. So do you believe that there's going to be this loan and lending pressure because they will face the alternative that they will be basically have to be buying the domestic bonds?
Yes, thank you very much, Maria. And indeed, lending is not just an issue for banks and the National Bank, which sets the refinancing conditions, but there are also other players here, right? And that was one aspect was already mentioned by Kateryna Rozhkova in the beginning when she talked about creditor protection and also the need to have the right laws in place. So that's an issue for Parliament, so that the interest rate margins can go down if banks are more safe to lend their money, especially long term. Then they feel much safer and they can reduce the margins, the interest rate margins, so the interest rates go down and more lending is available. That's something that really shows also international experience. But turning to the topic you raised, the budget, indeed, there are some worrying signs in the draft budget for next year. Again, we're talking about the draft budget, so hopefully there will be still some changes and hopefully in the right direction, not in the wrong direction. There was always, of course, a risk that it can go in the other direction. What I'm worried about is crowding out. That's something that I think every student of economics learns in the first semester, where the state absorbs the majority of financial resources and the private sector has much less room to borrow. And for next year's budget, I mean, we have a deficit, a planned deficit of 6% of GDP after a plan of 7.5% this year. So we do not really see a big consolidation. And I mean, everyone agrees that this year, 2020, is exceptional, that the governments around the world are really fighting hard with their instruments with fiscal policy, especially to soften the blow on GDP. So for this year, I'm fully in line that deficits should be high, but then this is an exceptional case. And next year, especially if you have already an optimistic growth forecast, you should be much more ambitious on the fiscal on the deficit side. And 6% of GDP is, in my view, not ambitious enough. That translates into significant financing needs, hundreds of billions of local government bonds that need to be issued. And these are competing with the resources for the banks. And so here I think the government needs to be more pushing for a lower deficit. And also the other thing is about the structure of the budget. If you have the minimum wage increases, which are not really supported by productivity increases, you have another potentially inflationary source in the budget that may also lead to inflationary pressures increasing, and then the NBU needs to react in its monetary policy to these challenges. So overall, I think the budget is something that really needs to be improved if we want to see a further recovery in lending, and that was a starting point of this discussion. So yes, I think the budget has an impact. So far, I think a negative one. And I do hope that there will be an improvement in the further readings.
Дуже дякую, Роберт.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert. And I would like to address to all of the participants of our panel, if you would like to react and if you would like to say something, so please do not forget to raise your hand. You can do that through this participants panel and raise hand menu. And I do believe that your points of view are going to be very important. But I would like to ask Vitaliy Shapran, the member of the NBU's board and the Council of NBU, because I know that he's really following the monetary policies. And I would like to ask you, what does the Council of the NBU think about this deficit of budget and its potential influence to the banking lending and to the banking sphere overall? And once again, what will be the potential recapitalization and monetization of this deficit throughout the emissions by the National Bank? So what do you think about that, and what is the point of view for the NBU Council? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity to join the discussion. What I really want to say, that Council of NBU is a collegial body, and I believe that I cannot speak on behalf of all of the members of the NBU's council. So this is going to be my personal opinion as an individual member of the NBU's council. But I would like to say that there is a certain legislation that has been approved by the National Parliament, which is the basis of the monetary policies of NBU, and the monetary policies is going to be just as well as it was. So we're basically working on the investment targets, and Ukraine has been identified by the IMF as a country with this regime throughout 41 countries all over the world. So by this basis of the monetary policy, we have outlined the investment tariff of more than 5% plus minus 1 investment point. I can then give you smaller, shorter secret. There is a discussion around this indicator. Nobody from the council has speak out on this credit level, on this rate level. I believe that this overall credit for Ukraine was optimal, and I believe that using this investment rate that we currently have was really far away from optimal for Ukraine. But we have done some significant steps in that for the last 3 years. We have built up the tools to influence the inflation, to influence the money flow. We have stimulated some certain empirical legislation that are important for Ukrainian economy, because we have more than 50% of economy in the shadow sector. It cannot be reflected. It also is reflected in our monetary policies as well. And I want to say that the Council of the NBU of Ukraine has started a discussion with our Western loan loan givers. So basically, in order to change the monetary policy, but those changes are only be dealing and considering with the 2022. So in 2021, we will still develop to live under the rate of 5 plus minus 1 investment pound. What is going to be the difference between the flexible targeting and what we've had before? Well, in our point of view, we do not have this flexible targeting regime yet. So what do we have is basically quite harsh targeting that we have. And if you can see the targeting in India or in Turkey, then you will see that they have some really, really big corridor of fluctuation and variability. We have plus one, and in Turkey they have 4 plus minus 2. The very same in India. So there is like around 8 countries from this 41. They have this rate of more than 5%. They have a very broad corridor of fluctuation. But the tools and the level of the development of financial market is much, much better than we have, unfortunately. And in my personal view, the parliament of the Eighth Assembly, they were not only they have had postponed a lot of legislation, and we had the legislation on derivatives, and there has been a certain toolkit that we didn't have to increase the effectiveness of using the interest rate as the main tools of our monetary policy is not available yet on the market. So you're currently discussing whether the crisis has come to an end or no, because I wouldn't be that fast with evaluation, because our currently banking system and monetary system is very inertious. And basically, based on the change of our rate, then we can see that the there is going to then the compliance between our interest rates and how it's going to influence the real markets and indeed, then it will take 6 months to 12 months. If we'll take a look at the US or the European Union, then we see that the reaction of the market is happening as soon as the central bank only speaks of their expectations and assumptions. So, the rate hasn't really yet changed, but the overall exchange indexes are changed already. We have nothing like that in Ukraine. And moreover, we have additional systematic specific of the situation currently. And I would like to draw your attention to this moment that our money and cash aggregators have grown significantly for this first months of this year. And so our NL has great growth for overall 7 billion. The cash flow M1 has has grown by 41 billion, but the GDP has decreased. And what we want to have the low inflation in place. So we declare that we want to have 5% on this level. But our Western colleagues that have telling us about the inflation risks, they're very right in that. Because basically, if we will compare ourselves to Sweden, for example, Sweden has M0 or M1 is around 2%. So currently, we have more than 53%. And so if our Western colleagues and from the central banks from the developed countries is not a problem for them, because throughout their credits, they have incited the banks with the cash flow, and they can socialize it and monetize it. So for us to get M0 from the market will be really problematic. So yes, there is some certain migration between cash and the cashless and cashless payments, but to take away 87 billion that has been inserted and incepted into the flow, it will be a lot of problematic for us. I have been listening very clearly to Kateryna and to Mr. Pisaruk very clearly for them identify that the recovery is happening. Yes, according to our official statistic, then yes, that's if you will take a look at the overall consumption flow, then yes, what we have seen in the number of transactions, yes, it's growing. Yes, so this basically right now the lockdown of the economy has stopped, right? We get into this recovery, but this recovery is a very painful one, because basically the money that have been issued to the overall flow, their speed is turning to the normal situation of the flow. So we will need less of the available money, but there will be no additional opportunity for us to get them out of the flow system. We don't have it in place. So what we see now at the currency markets, those money through these importers, through M1, through these cashless transactions are going through the banks. So There's no miracles to happen, and this is the abnormality and the paradox of current situation, is that the recovery of economy will be also guided by the additional splash of inflation and additional splash on the currency market, and it's okay. And I do believe that the population should know about that and they should be prepared, but not to build up the expectations on something better to come, because at some certain time X, this money that we printed will end up to the system and the market will get back to normal existence. So the risks, the inflation risks will get back and the trends on the foreign exchange market will get back to normal. And speaking on the deficit itself, I believe that I might agree to our Western colleagues, but from another point of view and another rationale. I have noted down that our government doesn't really matter what kind of political situation they have, who's the head of the government, for quite a long time, and it's very for quite a long time, we know that the appetites, they're only growing, notwithstanding what kind of government is it. And currently, we can say that, level of the 6 or 7% is okay because the crisis has not yet changed. But what is also important to say that it's not a regular deficit of the budget. So after this 6%, we wouldn't have the deficit of for 2022 with like the 7% of deficit, and so on and so forth. So basically, there is some certain limitation of the fiscal domination. It has to happen in Ukraine because currently we are now actually reading out our colleagues from the European central banks who are saying that we should get back the fiscal domination throughout the time of crisis. So yeah, that sounds good, but that doesn't really work with us. It might not work with our situation. So there are some certain limitations that has to be established. So we shouldn't get back to this 3% because basically that will be fit negatively over all the business activity in Ukraine. But to automatically agree with everything that the Ministry of Finance offers, we should not do that, in my opinion. Thank you very much, Vitaliy. Kateryna, would you agree that, so basically I will reformulate the question. So the position of the managing board of NBU and the position of the member of the council of NBU, whether they're corresponding. Well, Vitaliy has said a lot of things and has noted down a lot of things in his speech, but basically on the issue of the deficit of the budget and potential threats through the fiscal outflow. Yes, we know that that happens, and yes, we are on the same page with that, with our Council of the National Bank. Throughout the period when the economy is in crisis, we know that the deficit grows. When the economy starts to recover from the crisis, then the deficit is narrowing. So we have the very same vision about it. In this case, that basically, yes, we cannot stick from today's deficit to the pre-crisis level, but it has to be done. It has to be done step by step. It has to be done gradually. But I would like to say that it's not really possible to discuss this without the Ministry of Finance. So, we cannot discuss budget and all of those risks, especially the financial risks, without the Ministry of Finance. And moreover, we understand that the budget is currently under work and there are some certain discussions that are being held with our international partners altogether. So we do hope, and let us believe, let us hope that is going to be the overall balanced option that will help us from one hand to step by step and gradually get to the target level of the deficit of the state budget. On the other hand, let us hope that it will have the certain stimulating effect for economy. Okay, I will have a very, let us say, straightforward question as for journalists and as for all of the other people, whether the NBU will monetize the budget deficit if it's going to be too big. So whether it's going to be done, like, let me start, as far as I'm the insider of that of the last year, because what has happened, we have discussed it at the council that the National Bank, as well as any other commercial bank, they need to have this kind of portfolio for the further own investment and further all sales. And the council has had that we should get to the second level, to the secondary markets with NBU. But when we had publish the information, then the people have thought that the national bank will straight away start to buy at the primary markets the bonds, and we will fully finalize and budget the deficit of the budget. But it has never been discussed then, it is not discussed today. There are different models for the national bank's participation on the secondary markets are being discussed. So maybe it is not good without the Ministry of Finance to evaluate their work, but what was happening, because the lack of the liquidity on the level of the internal bonds, it doesn't really look good. Why? Because we know if there's no liquidity available and through the big high margins on the secondary market, then the first quarter, the primary market hasn't been working at all. When the profitability on the secondary market grows significantly and the Ministry of Finance cannot have any loans, then the Ministry of Finance should do something about it. They have to do something about it. So we have offered them the help from the National Bank, but somehow through some certain staff policies, through the objective reasons, it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen in some time, I believe. And what was happening at the beginning of the second quarter that can be evaluated as, extraordinary conditions because of the corona crisis, but it wasn't really nice when the state banks, they wanted to get additional refinancement, but then they had some certain liquidity in place, and with a certain step, with a certain change in the certain way, they have bought the additional bonds, internal bonds for the country. As an anti-crisis measure, temporary anti-crisis measure, it's okay. As a regular policy, when the state banks are buying the local bonds on the market, is not okay. It's not the market, because it's basically putting one money from one pocket to another with a certain markup. So we have to deal with this situation in a way, because currently, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, once again, we don't have these participants in the market that will help, except for the National Bank, that will help for the Ministry of Finance to make the secondary market with normal liquidity and attractive for the residents, because they're also keeping up an eye on us, because this leaving of the non-residents, it has happened not just because of the events that we've had. It's not just because we had this postponement with our IMF agreement and the postponement of the new tranche. It also happened because we don't have a very good secondary market. It has very low liquidity. You cannot access it in an easy way. And when we had conducted our evaluation in November, then the residents has told us, the non-residents has asked us, can you make like an exchange of these bonds from grivnas to like foreign currency and vice versa? Because when we are asking to provide this exchange through our work, then we learn through our offices that the intra-bank rates adds up like 50 kopecas or even 1 hryvnia to that. So it's not really good for us. When you have these bad conditions to exit the market, when it's bad conditions to exchange the rate, the currency of the bond, when in the banks in portfolio you have those overall inflation bonds that you cannot evaluate in the easiest way. It's really hard to evaluate them. So we will have what we have. So we will have those really frightened non-residents that do not want to participate in the market, and as soon as they get into the market, they will leave as well. And we'll have some certain problems with the work of the primary market, because those plans that have been voiced out by the government, I believe that they are able to engage this amount of money that they have voiced out. But the banking system, maybe not all of the banking system, but with the help of the non-residents, for the residents, they can engage this amount of money. The issue is on how to organize the work of the secondary market so that it will not hold back the work of the primary markets. And if we consider the future, which is like far after 2022, when we have discussed what would be the model for the participation of the national bank participation in the bonds market, then maybe there's creation of the national fund. And I would like to say that for our audience, it is not that much important, but maybe then basically you can prove me wrong. It's not that important of whether the national bank will participate in the currency market or no. It will be important for them to know what will be the overall amount and share of the internal domestic bonds in overall portfolio of the national bank. That this is basically the final control point whether we finance the deficit of the budget or no. And there are many different options discussed on this issue. For example, on all of these anti-crisis actions. So maybe if the national banks that they can increase or decrease the certain share of their participation in the overall bond market. For example, they can increase these debts in the debts that has decreased in the recent 3 years. So maybe there will be like a limit of 100 or 50 billion. So there can be a certain situation that this model, for example, as the result of this discussion, it will be changed. But basically, right now, maybe we'll have some certain journalists participating here. So I would like to once again emphasize that currently we're speaking that the National Bank will participate directly with the financing of the state budget. We're not discussing it yet because it is prohibited by the legislation. And in order to change this model, even the most progressive model that will be acceptable by all of our creditors, we have to change the law of Ukraine on the National Bank. Kateryna, you would like to add up something because Vitaliy, unfortunately, we have less than 20 minutes before the overall events end up. So if we have some additional questions from the audience, that we should save some time. Kateryna, would you like to add up something? Well, yes, the good answer to this development of the secondary markets question is very relevant for us when we have seen that there is an interest for Ukraine for that, because basically that is a huge interest in our for non-residents in our domestic bonds. So if you remember that we had this clear stream investment program that would basically really helped us to improve the situation in collaboration with non-residents. So basically we have outlined that we didn't have the secondary market as we wanted it to be, but we're considering now the models and we really should consider them further on. What I really wanted to say that we have to understand that the developed markets are the most vulnerable for the crisis periods up till for the interest of the non-residents in this clear-stream situation. So it's all feeling that because under the framework of the crisis, all of those markets are very volatile. And we have seen that's happening with us as well. But currently the situation has already stabilized and we can see that basically the rates of the secondary market that are just corresponding to the situations at the primary markets. Okay, thank you. I will just get some figures to our discussion just for us to understand what volumes are we speaking about right now. So overall, the domestic bonds for the next year, there has to be 550 billion hryvnias. In the same way, currently, right now, the banks own, the foreign banks own, currently at this very moment, 100 billion. Non-residents have 90 billion, private bank with private capital, something more than 50 population, and the companies overall have around 30 billion hryvnias overall in the domestic bonds. So this is the overall amount of the market that is not in the state owned. So basically that has to be the market of the overall 550 billion. So but what we now have covered is 270 billion, which is basically twice as big. 550 is twice as big than what currently is owned by the banking sector players. So, okay, I would like to have a couple of the questions to read out. Some questions that we've had. There was, first of all, there is the gratitude to Vitaliy Shapran for his professionalism, and the second gratitude is to Kateryna for informing us on the policies of the NBU and on the reforms and the transparency of the financial market and inflations. And thank you very much for this opportunity for the online transaction. That was the comment from Facebook to our conversations. And we have some questions as well. I believe that there will be questions for the we've already covered in the previous discussion, but the second part of this question, what is going to be the overall rate till the end of 2020 and throughout 2021? We have already said that there are some certain inflation risks in place, and we understand that there is certain deficit of the budget, and we see that inflation risks getting even more real. So, Kateryna, what will be the rate overall? Well, According to our final monetary committee meeting, that we would say that basically in our case, the monetary policy, and as Vitaliy has also outlined, the main milestones will be just the way that we have outlined before. So we will basically follow the current situation and how the situation might influence the future. So what that means for us, that basically means that if the inflation is going to grow and if the inflation risks are going to be significant, then the national bank will make this decision to a harsher monetary policy and vice versa. But so basically, currently, we are holding this lower rate consciously almost getting to the zero level, because basically we understand that throughout those periods that we currently are now in, that we have to find a certain stimulus for economy. The next assembly for the monetary committee will be held in October. We will analyze the situation, review our forecast and assumptions, and we will further on reconsider the reworked budget, if it will be reworked by that time, and based on the results of the assembly of the monetary committee, we can say something precisely. There's mostly question to Mr. Bosaruk, I guess. Until we have the agreement with the IMF, non-residents cannot participate in the activity of the secondary markets, and the biggest creditor for the state can only be our own population, and that will be around 80 plus billion dollars of USD dollars. So basically, they could offer the population an interesting tool in order to allocate this already deadline money. So yes, I have heard this idea that, working in Ukrainian securities market, that it's really hard to engage Ukrainian population, even though they have quite a lot of money for the overall security and bonds market. But I would like to ask Mr. Bosaruk, as a practitioner who works with the population, as the manager of the bank who has worked in a lot of branches all over the country. You work with retail. So do you see that opportunities to engage Ukrainian population to the securities markets overall? Well, thank you very much. I believe that this kind of a tool to engage the population, it can be created, and we had it in the Soviet market when the population has financed the state budget. I think that it can be created, but in my opinion, I'm not sure that whether Ukrainian population are going to be readily finance the deficit of the state budget in those amounts that you have mentioned. Even if this instrument was available right now, I do not see that the population would finance those 550 billion or any other amount of money that you've voiced out. Unfortunately, I believe that for us, for Ukraine, in the recent couple of years, we will not be able to take down the our connection with the international loan givers. So collaboration with IMF is the best chance that we have, the best scenario that we have, and I do believe we have to do that. And I would like to be honest by saying that we have some certain that we have some certain that we have some certain concerns that the IMF program is currently being put on hold, and it creates some really strict risks for 2020 and 2021 for the financing of the budget and for the sources of this kind of additional financing for the budget. And if external creditors that will not feel comfortable with working with Ukraine, and if the IMF program will not be settled, then it's not clear how we're going to end up with additional costs for the budget. I would agree with you completely that we have analyzed it when we have seen some similar results, as well as what is going on with the IMF program. Kateryna, maybe you have some certain news that you can share with us, some good news that you can share with us. Well, right now I have no additional news. That's something that has already been voiced out before, because basically right now we're under negotiation process. We're now collaborating all together. The national banks has its own commitments and has its own structural milestones that we're currently is working on, and those working on the banking legislation. There is finalizing this the guarantee of the deposits legislation on the building up their liquidity. So there is an issue of creating these toolkits and approving the plan on the bad debts and the non-profitable loans of the national banks that is currently in process. So we are in the process of building up those structural milestones that will help us to work out together with the next mission of IMF when it will come. As far as we know, the Ministry of Finances currently works with the budget, and I know that from external sources. So let us hope that all of the participants for this process, and we have a lot of those, this is basically the Cabinet of Ministries, National Bank, the Office of the President, they will do all of their homework, and we will have this opportunity to continue in the work with the IMF. Thank you very much. The next question, and I think that I would agree to this question also, and I would like to pose this question to all of our panelists today. The economy has started its work, but the forecasts of IMF and international experts, they say that the full recovery of the economical development of the country will require 3-5 years. What is your opinion to all of the participants of our panel? So what do you see? How do you see the economical recovery for a couple of next years? I've heard that Robert today has mentioned the downfall number for 2020 around 7%, because I was surprised at that, because a lot of people have already reconsider their forecast. We also believe that it's not going to be that significant because, recovery has its own shape. It has this V-shaped structure, and we're really happy with that. So maybe 2021 would be much better. 2020 would be much better than expected, and 2021 would be nice. But I would like to outline the forecasts for our colleagues from Vitaliy, because I know that Vitaliy Kravchuk, because I know that, like, how do you expect to see 2020, the end of 2020, and how do you expect to see 2021? Let us do it one by one, I guess. So we will start with Robert and Garry. And what are your forecasts? What are your assumptions for the next year to come?
Yeah, well, first of all, for this year, I mean, we did together with the Institute, with Vitaliy, a forecast in March, April, basically when this crisis hit the globe. And at that time, our benchmark forecast was 7%, but we had also two scenarios because there was such a high uncertainty. One was more positive, so it was a smaller decrease of 5.9%, and then also a more negative scenario. And I think the data so far point to the fact that we are seeing a better recovery than originally expected. So I think we are more on this 5.9 GDP, minus 5.9 GDP decline scenario. This year, regarding the next year, it's hard for me to make any forecast, and I think the uncertainty is equally high. Because I mean, we have the discussion of a possible second wave, or in Ukraine, I think there is a second wave. The question is how to react on that. Will the measures be tightened or not? So still a significant degree of uncertainty, I would say, for next year. But I mean, I don't think that 3 to 5 years is a realistic time frame. I think the overall recovery will be quicker, faster in terms of GDP. But some sectors, I think, will continue to struggle for a longer time, especially in the service part of the economy.
Vitaliy.
Vitaliy, well, I would say that yes, the forecast of 7%, this is something that we've done together some certain time ago. But speaking on reconsidering this forecast, yes, we believe that recovery would be much faster. There's one moment from what we see. But we also see the impact of the overall lockdown for the economy that we've expected to see, that it was prolonged, but it has a smaller scale than we've expected it to see, so it's not that viable. So maybe that can be a significantly lower downfall that we've expected at around maybe 5%, 4 or 5% of GDP. But basically the uncertainty is really high, especially if we speak about next year, because once again, the recovery really depends on what kind of the decrease and what kind of downfall will happen this year. So basically, we expect to see there has to be some certain bumps, moments. So basically, which means that what we will save actually this year, that will actually come back next year. So I wouldn't expect a really significant increase. So that will be around like 2 or 3% of growth. And I think that in a couple of next years. But this, once again, it will strongly depend on how the pandemic will develop in Ukraine, because currently we already see that it seems that we have some risks that it might continue in doing the spin-over of the economy. Yes, that's true, right? You are. It seems like just this Friday we have had a discussion with the professionals in healthcare, and we have discussed the budget for healthcare, and we have also voiced out some of their fears on the second wave of the lockdown and the second stage of the lockdown. And we currently have voiced out that we don't even have the second wave. We have just had this first wave coming, the one that has been in Europe in spring. And this is something that is happening right now with Ukraine. And I know that Aval are doing their macroeconomical assumptions annually. Can you maybe voice out some of the moments? Yeah, you know, I can voice out some of the assumptions and some of the forecasts, but I believe that the quality of this forecast is not really high because, like everyone said, there's really high level of unpredictability and level high of the uncertainties. When you have the high uncertainties, then economy cannot get really fastly for the further on growth and restoration and recovery of the previous position. Because if there's certain uncertainty, then people do not buy and do not spend money a lot. So there is some certain moments, as Robert has already said, that some of the sectors, especially connected with the services like tourists, tourism, airlines, hotels, hospitality businesses, they've already were really struck by the crisis. So we're now getting to the moment while we're still waiting for the moment when we'll have the vaccines developed, when it's going to be industrially produced. I do believe only then the people will start to fear the virus, and then we'll have the uncertainty taken down. But at least will take at least 2 more years, I believe. Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else would like to say something about the forecast? We don't have Dmytro Solokhov with us. I do believe that he would tell us a little bit of the forecast from the NBU. But dear colleagues, if you have any comments, any final comments or final ideas, I would like to ask you to do that. We only have 3 minutes left. Okay, no more comments, no more. Oh, Maria, I think I will do that. We don't have the Dmytro Solokhov here, but I would like to say that the final forecast, the assumption that we've had in April this year, it presupposed that we're going to have around 7%, 6% of the GDP fall, but we will have a growth of GDP around 4%. But of course, we will review our forecast and assumptions in October, and there is really huge dependence of our economy on what is going on in the world, on the world economy, and on the overall demand on our exports. And it will also depend on the prices of the energy, how it's all going to be happening. So I would agree to my colleagues, that's basically all of the forecasts and assumptions. Currently, they're not really precise. So the overall, the preciseness of this forecast cannot be considered ideal because this uncertainty with the pandemic is undermining all of those forecasts. They're all going to be very approximate. So, but let us consider, let us hope that based on the structure of our economy, we will be able to restore, not in the V shape, as we've already been said, but we will be able to recover, to start the recovery, significant recovery in the nearest time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Then, having all that said, dear colleagues, dear attendees, I wish you to stay in good health. I wish you all to be resilient. I wish you to recover as soon as possible and to increase your welfare. Thank you very much for being with us, the Center for Economic Strategy, on behalf of the German Economic Group, together with the Institute of Economy Research and Political Studies. Stay with us, and we'll hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
До побачення.